In 70 AD, Roman soldiers attacked Jerusalem, burned the temple, killed the people who were defending it, and brought the holy objects back to Rome as trophies. It was a punishment. The Jews had started 4 uprisings in 70 years, and Rome decided has ever done this. How can that even be possible? How did a few tribes living on a small piece of land between the desert and the sea write a book that led to 3 world created a complex web that held the whole developed world together. Thousands of miles away, tin was sent to bronze. Grain moved from Greece to Egypt. Weapons went from Mesopotamia to the coast. When droughts and famines hit, those trade chains started to break, and everything fell apart at once, with one thing pulling the next. The Hittite Empire, which had been around for hundreds of years, was no longer there. The Cretaceous civilization came to an end. Egypt was broken and would never be as strong as it used to be. Many city-states in Canaan were in ruins. People really forgot how to write. Whole systems of writing died and were never brought back to life, and it was on these ruins that the people who would later be known as the Israelites came to be. It's still not clear where they came from. The Bible says that they were descendants of Abraham who had left Egypt. Archaeology suggests that they were probably Semitic tribes from the same area. They were part of the wave of people who moved into the empty lands of Canaan during the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. They learned the local language, how to farm like the locals, and even how to worship the local gods. Over time, they started to see themselves as one group. We know that their neighbors called this group Israel, or at least that is what they called them. Around 128 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Manpa ordered a list of his victories to be carved in stone. One line on the list is for the cities and people he had conquered. Israel is destroyed. Its seed is gone. This is the earliest known use of the word Israel. It was written as an obituary. The pharaoh was sure that he had killed this group of people for good. The Bible talks about 12 tribes of Israel, which were groups of people who lived in Canaan. But the number 12 was holy all over the Near East. The number 40 in the Bible doesn't mean 40 years. It means a generation. There were probably that many tribes, maybe 10 or so. And their history books just rounded it up to the famous 12. But some group of related tribes came to this land and made it their home. Archaeology backs that up. Their early religion was very different from what we know as Judaism today. Excavations have found inscriptions like, "I pray to Yahweh of Hebron and his Asher," which means that Yahweh, the god, had a wife. People thought that Yahweh of Hebron and Yahweh of Samaria were 2 different gods. This was not the belief in one god. It was more like a tribal religion with a main god, but not the only one. It would be hundreds of years before true monotheism came about, and the road to it would be much more difficult than anyone could have imagined. Around the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 1st millennium BC, the tribes of Israel came together to form a state. The Bible says that 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, were involved. The material culture of the era substantiates the existence of a substantial political entity centered in Jerusalem during this period. Why Jerusalem? Not because of being holy, that would happen later, because of the water in a place where every well is worth its weight in gold. Jerusalem is built on rich freshwater springs. Also, the city is on a trade route that goes through the hills, which is one of only 2 ways to get from the coast to the east, not mysticism. But geopolitics and hydrology made this city a capital. David builds an army, and it's important to know what time period this is. The Bronze Age collapse wiped out the old empires that had chariots and professional armies. War had changed in the New World, the world of the Iron Age. The costly chariot course had disappeared, and infantrymen with iron swords had taken their place. A sword cost less than a chariot, and iron was easier to get than bronze because it didn't need tin, which had to be shipped thousands of miles. War turned into a very personal, close quarters, and brutal affair. The Bible shows this perfectly. There are swords all over it, and wars end with the complete destruction of the loser. Men were killed, women were made slaves, and cities were burned. These rules were followed by everyone in the Near East, including the Israelites. The Assyrians, for instance, did the same thing, but on a much larger scale, and with great pride that was carefully recorded. Solomon builds the first temple, the Jerusalem temple, which is dedicated to the God Yahweh. And this wasn't just a place to pray, it was the only place on earth where people could legally make sacrifices to God. And the sacrifices of that time were very different from what we think of when we hear the word worship. Today, 7 times on major holidays, the blood of sacrificial animals was sprinkled on the altar. Their guts were hung up in a very strict order. The walls, the priests' hands and ears, they were all covered in blood. And the smell of burning meat was, as the text says, food that was given to God and eaten by him. A small group of priests did all of this. The Kohanim, who taught the ritual to their children and grandchildren. The religious life of a whole people depended on one building and one group of people who knew how to do things right. It's important to remember this because when that building is gone, the whole system will fall apart, and people will have to come up with a whole new way to believe. But the temple's destruction is still a long way off. The first thing that happens is the split. The United Kingdom fell apart after Solomon died around 930 BC. The Kingdom of Israel was in the north, with its capital in Samaria, bigger, richer, but not as connected to the temple in Jerusalem. Judah, which was smaller and poorer than the other kingdoms that had the temple, stayed in the south. The 2 kingdoms worshipped Yahweh, but in different ways. The northerners built their own altars on their own holy mountains. The southerners thought this was wrong. Their hatred for each other grew stronger over time. People from the north were called traitors and half-breeds. People were horrified when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan 1,000 years later. A Samaritan, and all of a sudden good. The point of the parable was to shock people. For about 200 years, the 2 kingdoms would be next to each other. Then, a force from the east would come and destroy one of them for good. In 720 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was attacked by Assyria, which had the strongest army in the world at the time. The people were sent far into the empire. This was normal for the Assyrians. Take a group of people away from their home country and spread them out among strangers. Though they can never come back together, the 10 tribes in the north are gone for good. In 701 BC, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, also took over Canaan. He besieged Jerusalem in an effort to conquer Judea. Both the Bible in the 2nd book of Kings and the Annals of Sennacherib talk about this event. The Jewish source says that angels blew horns to scare Sennacherib away, but he says that the Judeans gave him gifts to spare him. The truth is likely to be somewhere in the middle. Southern Judah lasted for another 150 years, but in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II came, the same king who may have built the Hanging Gardens and the Ishtar Gate. Judah had been fighting back, not paying tribute, and looking for friends to help them fight Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar decided to end it once and for all. He destroyed Jerusalem, burned the first temple, which was the center of the people's religious life, and sent the Judean elite to Babylon. Not everyone stayed on the land. Regular peasants did, but the priests, scribes, and nobles, who held the knowledge and traditions, were captured. This is where the turning point happens, and it will change the course of all of human history. Think about the situation: a small group of people who have lost everything, their kingdom, capital, temple, and land, are all in the middle of a huge civilization at this point. Babylon is the inheritor of thousands of years of Mesopotamian culture. It had taken all of its Mesopotamian counterparts, including the Assyrian, because of its Sumerian and Akkadian roots. The Jews had never heard of its myths before. It had a lot of libraries. Its cities were beautiful. A lot of other groups would have broken up in a generation. And many did. The Assyrians sent dozens of nations into exile, and none of them kept their identity. The Jews were the only ones who didn't. They were in Babylon, without their temple, their priesthood, or any of the other things that were important to their faith. They did something that had never been done before. They started writing down their oral traditions, genealogies, laws, prophecies, the history of their kings and wars, and everything else that made them who they were. They didn't write to impress their conquerors or to decorate a palace. They wrote so that their children would still know who they were a generation later. The body of texts we now call the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, probably came together in Babylon. These texts had been evolving for centuries prior to that. It was written and shared in Israel itself, and later discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed this. They were put together, edited, and shaped into the single work we know today while they were in exile. Modern textual scholarship demonstrates that it is a compilation of various documents authored at distinct periods by different writers, each possessing divergent conceptions of God. In some parts, God is like a person. He goes into the tabernacle, sits down, and tells the people there that the smell of the sacrifices must be good for him. In some, he is abstract, has no body, and speaks from a place beyond the heavens. Scholars still argue about how many source documents there are, but there is no doubt that the text is a mix of different sources, and this is what is really amazing. The Jews didn't just write down their own customs. They lived next to the Babylonians. They took the oldest Mesopotamian myths and changed them. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, tells how the gods made the world in 6 days and then had a feast on the 7th. The order is the same every day in Genesis, but there is only one God instead of many. The Babylonian story of the flood. Utnapishtim builds a ship, lets a raven go, and then a dove becomes the story of Noah. The story of Sargon the Great, who was put in a basket, set adrift on a river, and found by a gardener, became the story of Moses, the Garden of Eden, which was not a metaphor in Mesopotamian culture, but a real place, an island in the Persian Gulf that may be modern-day Bahrain, also made its way into the Bible as the beginning of all human history. And here's something that most people miss after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge in Genesis. God says, "Look, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now, lest he reach out his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." God does not banish man for disobedience. He sends him away because man, now that he knows, might be able to live forever. And in the Sumero-Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, the hero looks for the tree of life, which gives him eternal youth. One myth is about looking for ways to live forever. The other one is about why it can't be reached. They both came from Mesopotamia. We got both of them from the Jewish Bible. Sumerian myths lived on after Sumer. Babylonian stories lived on after Babylon did. And this only happened because a small group of people who were prisoners turned them into their own text and carried that text through the ages. If it weren't harsh changes started under the guidance of the scribe Ezra. The community kicked out foreign wives and the kids they had with them. People who were not Jews were not allowed to marry. For the first time ever, it was clear who was a Jew and who wasn't, and this line went along both blood and faith. It is only during this time, and not before or after, that Judaism becomes what we know it as today. a strict form of monotheism with a strict set of rules that set its followers apart from everyone else. The monotheism that had started as a tribal cult among many others was changed while the people were away and came back as a sealed, unbreakable system that could handle any outside pressure. But the troubles were just starting because a new conqueror was already coming from the west, bringing not just an army, but a whole civilization. In the 330s BC, Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire, which was the empire that had protected the Jews since the time of Cyrus. He had conquered land from Greece to India in just 10 years. Greek culture spread across the Near East after his armies left. Historians call this process Hellenization, and it started with gymnasiums, theatres, and philosophical schools. This meant a new choice for the Jews: either accept the Greek world or fight it. A lot of people agreed. A large Jewish community grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, the biggest city in the Hellenistic world. They spoke Greek and didn't understand Hebrew anymore. The Bible was translated into Greek by learned Hebrews and other scholars. This is the Septuagint, which would later be used to make the Old Testament for Christians. And it was this translation, a blend of Jewish and Greek ideas, that would quietly change the future. The first book of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, said, "In the beginning, God made heaven and earth." The Greeks saw this as a creation by word by logos. As the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the Word," and in Platonic philosophy, logos signifies not merely a word but the essential principle governing the universe. This change in philosophy gave Christianity the language it would use to talk to the Greco-Roman world as a future world religion, but Hellenization also caused a lot of anger. The Maccabean revolt started when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV tried to put up an altar to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple and took away the rights of Jews. The rebels did something that seemed impossible. They took back Jerusalem and set up the independent Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted for almost 100 years. But in 63 BC, Rome came and took away independence. The Romans took over Judea. At this time, Judaism was going through a serious crisis within itself. Many groups, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and others, fought about the right way to believe, how to understand the law, and how to deal with Roman power. Jesus was born into a Jewish family in Nazareth that was divided and occupied. His instruction was initially part of numerous reformist sects within Judaism. Back then, there were a lot of these groups. The Apostle Paul did something that changed everything after the Romans killed him. He took down the walls that had kept Judaism separate from the rest of the world for hundreds of years: circumcision, kosher laws, complicated ritual rules, and welcoming everyone. Christianity stopped being a Jewish sect and grew into a world religion over the course of several hundred years. For the Jews, this created a sad contradiction. It gave the world God, prophets, holy books, and a new religion that came from their own tradition. History has called them the worst villains ever. The Jews were blamed for killing Christ, and this accusation would follow them for the next 1,000 years. And this is what made the Jews' place in the Christian world so painful. The church needed them and hated them at the same time, needed them to show that the Bible is true. A person who saw something, people who were miserable, and showed what happens to those who don't believe in the Messiah, hated them because they wouldn't accept that role and kept believing in their own way. In 70 AD, Rome destroys the Second Jerusalem Temple, which was rebuilt after the Jews returned from Babylon, and then greatly expanded by Herod the Great. The last big revolt, Bar Kokhba, is put down between 132 and 135 AD. The Romans changed the names of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina and Judea to Syria Palestina. There is a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus on the Temple Mount where the Temple of Yahweh used to be. Jews are kicked out of Jerusalem and the area around it in large numbers, and they are not even allowed to go near the city. People who weren't killed or sold into slavery moved all over the Roman Empire, from Alexandria to Antioch to Rome to Carthage and then to the Balkans, Spain, and the Rhine. The temple is no longer there. The priests, or Kohanim, who led the services are no longer there. The sacrifices that had been the center of religious life for hundreds of years are no longer there. Everything these people had lived by for 2,000 years is gone. So they made themselves new again. What happens next has never happened before in history. A people without a state, land, or army survives for 2,000 years by replacing the temple with writing and the priests with teachers. The synagogue takes the place of the destroyed temple. It is a place where people read and talk about scripture instead of making sacrifices. The rabbi, a teacher and scholar of the law, takes the place of the hereditary priest Cohen. He is chosen for his knowledge rather than his family line. The oral Torah commentaries on the sacred text that tradition had forbidden to write down are written down after all because otherwise they would be lost all over the world. So the Mishnah seems to give short explanations of each verse. Then, for every 2 or 3 lines of Mishnah, there are 5 to 10 pages of extra commentary, debate, parables, and legal analysis. The Talmud is all of it put together. A huge number of texts that set down rules for every part of life, from how to split up a found cloak to whether or not you can light a candle on the Sabbath from a young age. Every boy learns how to read and understand text. They don't just memorize it. They learn how to argue, find contradictions, and build arguments. This isn't what we mean by education today. It is a way to teach analytical thinking that lasts all of childhood. When Jews come out of their communities and into European society, hundreds of years later, this skill will give you a huge edge over your competitors. But that will come later. Arab armies carrying Islam came out of the Arabian deserts in the 7th century. They take over all of North Africa, the Near East, and then Spain. At first, the change of rulers gave the Jews living in these areas more protection than they had before. The early Islamic government gave Jews a protected status in the new order through the so-called Constitution of Medina. Dhimmi. Arab rulers called them people of the book. They had to pay a special tax for being tolerant of other religions, and they couldn't pray loudly or build houses of worship taller than mosques. Other than that, they were free to do what they wanted. Historians say that the golden age of Muslim Spain starts in the 9th and 10th centuries. This was also the golden age of Arab Islamic civilization, and Jews were important figures in it as scholars, commentators, and translators. Writers like Maimonides and Ibn Ezra had a big impact on studying the works of Greek philosophers, translating them, and adding to grammar and linguistics. They wrote both in Hebrew and in Arabic script. It was a real mix of cultures. At the same time, Jews acted as middlemen between different cultures, buying textiles in Cordoba, swords in France, slaves in the Balkans, and spices in India. In the 8th century, a Jewish merchant could travel from Spain to China in one trip through a network of communities all over the world. Before the internet, they had their own internet, but the Crusades changed everything. In 1096, when tens of thousands of Europeans set out for Jerusalem, the first people to die were not Muslims. The mob's reasoning was straightforward. Why walk 3,000 meters to fight the enemies of Christ when they are right across the street? Prams in the Rhineland destroyed whole towns. A spiral starts from this point. Prams, accusations of poisoning wells, the blood lie, and the false story that Jews kidnap Christian kids for their rituals. England kicks the Jews out in 1290 and keeps them out for 350 years. France kicks them out in 1306, but 9 years later invites them back. It turns out that the monasteries had started giving loans at 40 to 60% without Jewish moneylenders charging 8%. In 1492, Spain kicked out the largest and richest Jewish community in Europe in response to the pogroms. Rabbis came up with a doctrine of non-resistance. Do not fight if they come to kill you. Say a prayer if they try to change your children's religion. It is better to kill them than to let them join a foreign faith. Martyrdom has been a part of Jewish culture for 1,000 years, and it will still be a part of it in the 20th century. The Jews are kicked out of everywhere, but they find safety in Poland. Cosmere the Great and later Sigismund saw them as a way to make money. Wherever Jews go, trade comes with them, along with tax money and account books. For the first time in taxes, and sold vodka. There were no Jewish communities left on the left bank of Ukraine because the killing was so thorough. Chroniclers talk about wells full of children's bodies, corpses with their guts freaked out, and the slave markets of Constantinople overflowing with captives from Ukraine. It was a disaster for the Jews, like the destruction of the temple, and from that disaster, insanity was born. In 1665, a rumor spread through the whole Jewish world, from Amsterdam to Yemen, that the Messiah had come. A man named Sabatvi from Smyrna said he was the savior. People sold their things, stopped fasting, and married of 9-year-old kids so that everyone could be born again before the world ended. When the Ottoman Sultan called the Messiah and gave him a choice between Islam and death, Sabatvi put on a turban and said the Shahada in just 1 minute. The biggest religious scam in Jewish history came to an end. Many people killed themselves. Thousands more became Muslims after him. But out of that disappointment would come Hasidism, a mystical, emotional movement that would say that honesty is more important than scholarship. 3/4 of all the Jews in the world lived in the Russian Empire by the 19th century. Their language is Yiddish, which is a mix of Hebrew, medieval German, and Slavic words. Their world is very religious and closed off from the outside world. And then that world blows up. A lot of the Jews who were kicked out of Spain moved to Ottoman lands, such as the European part of the empire and cities like Salonika in Greece today. Jews were recognized as one of the empire's religious minorities under the Ottoman millet system. For a while, they were safer there than anywhere else in Christian Europe. But the real change came from the West. In 1791, France, which was going through a revolution at the time, became the first country in Europe to pass a law giving Jews the same civil rights as everyone else. They could leave their communities for universities, courtrooms, medicine, and science for the first time in 1,000 years. And they do it so hard that Europe closes its doors, Talmudic training that lasts for centuries, endless debates, and the passing of subtexts within subtexts are all great ways to get ready for school and work. There are a lot of Jews in law offices, medical schools, and banks, which is strange. Instead of getting rid of anti-Semitism, freedom creates a new and even more dangerous kind of it. During the Middle Ages, a Jew could be baptized and become a full member of society. The hatred was based on religion, but by the end of the 1800s, racial theories are becoming more popular in Europe, and now people hate Jews because of where they come from and their blood, which can't be washed away. The Dreyfus Affair starts in France in 1894, the same country that first gave Jews their rights. A Jewish officer is found guilty of spying on false evidence. People in Paris are yelling death to the Jews. Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist, is one of the people who hears it. For him, it is a moment of truth. Assimilation is not effective. The only way out is for them to leave. He writes the Jewish state in 1896. In 1897, he calls the first Zionist Congress in Basel. He writes in his diary, "This will be real in 50 years. He will be 1 year off." Meanwhile, in the Russian Empire, in 1881, Tsar Alexander II is killed, and a wave of violence against Jews spreads across the south of the empire. Mobs steal from stores, burn down homes, and kill people of all ages and sexes. The word pogrom is used in all European languages. Alexander III, the new emperor, is a staunch anti-Semite. He not only doesn't stop the rioters, but he also makes anti-Jewish laws even stricter. Millions of Jews are stuck in the Pale of Settlement, a strip along the western edge of the empire where they aren't allowed to go. The easiest way for a Jewish girl to get out of the Pale is to register as a prostitute and get a yellow ticket. She could go to the capital and sign up for school. With it, that's how the Russian Empire was. The first Aliyah starts a wave of people moving to Palestine. Then the Ottomans took over. The map changes after World War I, the end of the Ottoman Empire. British mandate takes over Palestine. Arthur Balfour, Britain's foreign secretary, writes a letter in 1917 supporting the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the time he wrote it, 90% of the people in Palestine were Arab. The British make promises to everyone a place for Jews to live and freedom for Arabs, but at the same time, they make it very hard for Jews to come to the Earth by using quotas, the 1939 White Paper, and even stopping ships carrying refugees from coming to the Earth. They promise a home, but then they lock the door to it. It is not possible to keep both promises. The fight is already set in stone. Hitler takes over in Germany in 1933. The Nazi government will kill 6 million Jews, or 1/3 of the entire Jewish people, over the course of 12 years. A disaster that words can't describe. Europe destroyed the people who had given Europe a large part of its intellectual elite. The question is very important after the war. Jewish survivors all over Europe are desperate to get to Palestine, but the British are keeping the borders closed. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi are Jewish paramilitary groups that fight a guerrilla war against both Arabs and the British. The Irgun blows up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. This is where the British have their headquarters. There are 91 deaths. Britain has had enough. After the Second World War, the United Nations is in charge of the issue. The General Assembly votes on November 29, 1947, to split Palestine into two states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. The world should have control over Jerusalem. The Soviet Union votes in favor with 3 votes in order to weaken Britain's position in the area. The Soviet Union, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Belarusian SSR Czechoslovakia start sending secret weapons to the future Israeli army. Captured German weapons were among them, which is an ironic twist in history. The Arabs don't like the plan. Palestinian Arabs think it's unfair even though they only make up a third of the population. The Jews are being given 55% of the land. David Ben-Gurion, a left-wing politician from the Russian Empire, stands in the hall of a Tel Aviv museum under a portrait of Theodor Herzl on May 14, 1948. Just hours before the British mandate ends, he declares the State of Israel's independence exactly 51 years after Herzl predicted it. The next day, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon send their armies to attack the new country. Israel wins with an army made up of partisans, underground fighters, and Holocaust survivors. The war costs a lot for both sides. About 700,000 Palestinian Arabs leave their homes or are forced to leave them. The Arabs call this the Nakba, which means the disaster. They won't come back. More was come after the Syrian in 6 days and took the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and all of Jerusalem for the first it never went back to Zoroastrianism. The Jews lost it all. They lost their temple, their land, their kingdom, and 6 million of their people. But they lived. But they had to pay a price to stay alive that is still being paid. 2 groups now want the same small piece of land between the desert and the sea. Everyone has their own truth and their own disaster. One says independence in 1948, the other. Name for it is the Nakba. One remembers being away for 2,000 years. The other person remembers being sent away 70 years ago. And no court on earth can decide between 2 truths that are both true. There are now 15 million Jews, which is 0.2% of the world's population. But 1 in 5 Nobel Prize winners is Jewish. A single root gives rise to 3 world religions. The Jewish texts are the only way we got the myths that were written on clay tablets in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Pharaoh Mana carved into stone 3,000 years ago. Israel is in ruins, it has no more seeds. Anyone who wanted to could have said that phrase again since then. No one was able to do it.